Serah Alexander just lost everything. Her Mercedes, her credit cards, even her mansion, after failing every exam at one of America's priciest universities. With 3 days before expulsion and a fortune on the line, a janitor she'd never noticed whispered 6 words at 2 a.m. that could save her, or uncover the darkest secret on campus. If you believe privilege shouldn't protect failure, hit subscribe. Only the entitled would scroll past. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. She had the world at her fingertips, designer handbags that cost more than most people's rent, a penthouse apartment that overlooked Boston Harbor like a throne, and a father whose checkbook could erase any problem with a single signature. But beneath the silk blouses and perfectly styled hair, she was collapsing, failing spectacularly at the one thing money couldn't purchase, drowning in her own meaningless existence. Everyone had already written her off, professors who saw her as a lost cause, classmates who dismissed her as nothing more than a pretty face with an empty mind, even her father who secretly believed she'd never be anything without his name carved into the family crest. Then one night, in the fluorescent-lit hallway of a dormitory most students ignored, a janitor, a black man everyone looked through like he didn't exist, said 6 words that shattered the fortress she'd built around her ignorance. She thought he was just there to empty trash bins and mop floors. She had no idea he was about to empty out every lie she'd ever told herself. Her name was Serah Alexander, the only daughter of Alexander Ethan, a real estate mogul whose developments reshaped city skylines and whose name appeared in business magazines with the regularity of the seasons changing. Serah grew up in a world most people only glimpsed through magazine spreads and reality television. Private shopping appointments at Newberry Street boutiques, birthday celebrations at 5-star restaurants with guest lists that read like a social register, and summer vacations that required passports and personal assistants. But for all the designer labels hanging in her walk-in closet and all the Instagram followers who envied her curated life, one thing was glaringly absent: substance. At 20 years old, Serah attended one of Boston's most prestigious universities, not because she'd earned her acceptance through stellar grades or impressive essays, but because the Alexander name carried weight that transcended admissions requirements. No grueling entrance exams, no anxious waiting by the mailbox. Just a substantial donation to the new science building and a legacy admission that everyone understood but nobody dared question. Within those ivy-covered walls and historic lecture halls where generations of influential alumni had walked before her, Serah had become infamous for exactly 3 things: her inability to pass even the simplest exam, her wardrobe that changed daily like a fashion runway, and her complete indifference to the education her father was paying $250,000 for. Her academic record was a disaster wrapped in designer packaging. Professors gave her passing grades not out of recognition for her work, but out of fear of what challenging an Alexander might cost their department's funding. She didn't care, and why should she? Eventually, she'd inherit a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions. What could a degree actually do that her last name and trust fund couldn't accomplish faster? She skipped lectures without apology, submitted plagiarized essays she'd paid other students to write, and scrolled through her phone during the rare classes she bothered attending, as if the professor's words were nothing more than background noise to her perfectly curated existence. When her academic advisor once summoned her to discuss her failing grades, Serah had arrived 20 minutes late with a latte in one hand and her phone in the other, barely glancing up from her screen. "Is this really necessary?" she'd asked, her tone suggesting the meeting was an inconvenience she hadn't budgeted time for. "My father donates more in a year than most of these professors make in a decade. If you've ever met someone who thinks money makes them smarter, double tap this video right now. Let's prove hard work still matters. I think we'll be fine." The advisor had gone pale, stammered something about institutional standards, and ultimately let her leave without consequence. The story spread through campus like wildfire, cementing Serah's reputation as someone untouchable, someone the rules simply didn't apply to. At home, the dynamic wasn't much warmer. Her father, Alexander Ethan, was a man forged from ambition and calculation, a self-made millionaire who'd clawed his way from a working-class neighborhood to the top of Boston's real estate market through sheer determination and ruthless business acumen. He didn't believe in handouts, not even for his own blood. "You're an embarrassment," Alexander had said one evening after yet another call from the university about Serah's academic probation status. His voice was cold, measured, the same tone he used when firing underperforming executives. "If you worked for one of my companies, you'd have been terminated months ago." Serah had barely looked up from her phone, scrolling through her social media feed with practiced disinterest. "Good thing I'm your daughter and not your employee then," she'd replied, her voice dripping with the entitlement that came from never experiencing real consequences. "The world doesn't care about that distinction," Alexander had countered, his jaw tight with barely controlled frustration. "You either become someone worth respecting, or you'll spend your entire life being nothing more than another spoiled rich kid with a recognizable last name and absolutely no substance. And I will not enable that. I won't carry you." Comment: "No more excuses if you believe people should earn what they have. Only the lazy and entitled will stay silent." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, but Serah had dismissed it as another one of her father's empty lectures. He'd threatened consequences before. They never materialized. The next morning, Serah arrived at campus in her usual style, pulling up in her silver Mercedes convertible that she'd received for her 19th birthday. She strutted through the main quad in head-to-toe designer wear, Gucci sunglasses perched on her head, a Chanel bag swinging from her shoulder, heels clicking against the brick walkway with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Students parted like water around her, some staring with envy, others with barely concealed resentment. But Serah noticed none of it. She existed in her own bubble, impervious to judgment or consequence. Except one pair of eyes didn't look away. Near the dormitory entrance, an older black man, probably in his mid-50s, was methodically mopping the floor with practiced efficiency. His movements were deliberate, his posture upright despite the menial nature of his work, and his eyes sharp, observant, carrying a depth that suggested a story far more complicated than his janitorial uniform implied. Tracked Serah's careless path through the building. His name tag read Marcus Johnson, but Serah didn't notice it. To her, he was invisible, just part of the background. Another service worker whose purpose was to maintain the environment she moved through without ever truly seeing. But invisibility works both ways. While Serah couldn't see Marcus, he saw everything about her. The designer armor she wore to hide her emptiness, the performative confidence masking deep insecurity, the girl drowning in privilege who didn't even realize she needed saving. Then came the breaking point. Within 2 weeks, Serah's carefully constructed world began to crumble in ways she never imagined possible. First came the academic bombshell, a summons to the dean's office that she couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss, couldn't buy her way out of. Then came something even more shocking. Her father's promised consequences finally, brutally materialized. Her credit cards were declined mid-transaction at her favorite boutique. Her Mercedes was gone from the parking garage the next morning, sold without her knowledge. And when she returned to her penthouse apartment that evening, she found movers packing her belongings into boxes marked for a standard dormitory room. For the first time in her entire life, Serah Alexander was about to discover what it felt like when money couldn't solve everything, when privilege couldn't protect her, when she was forced to confront the terrifying truth that she'd never actually learned how to do anything on her own. And in that moment of complete collapse, the invisible man with the mop and the quiet eyes was about to become the only person who saw her as something more than her father's disappointing investment. And in that moment of complete collapse, the invisible man with the mop and the quiet eyes was about to become the only person who saw her as something more than her father's disappointing investment. But first, Serah had to hit rock bottom harder than she ever imagined possible. The penthouse apartment felt different the moment she walked through the door that evening, and it took her a few disoriented seconds to understand why. Boxes were stacked in the hallway, brown cardboard towers labeled with black marker in handwriting that wasn't hers. Moving blankets were draped over furniture she'd never given a second thought to, and two men in gray uniforms were carefully wrapping her designer lamps in bubble wrap with the efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. Her heart dropped into her stomach, a sick, twisting feeling that made her want to vomit right there on the marble floor. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice coming out smaller than she intended, the confidence she usually wore like armor suddenly feeling paper-thin. "Who are you people, and why are you touching my things?" One of the movers glanced up briefly, then looked past her to someone standing in the doorway of her father's study. Serah turned slowly, already knowing who she'd see, already dreading the look on his face. Alexander Ethan stood with his arms crossed, his expression carved from granite, cold and immovable. He was still in his work suit, charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt and a tie that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he looked every inch the ruthless businessman who'd built an empire through sheer force of will. But there was something different in his eyes tonight. Not anger, not even disappointment anymore, but something worse. Finality. "They're packing your belongings," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than dismantling his daughter's entire life. "You're being moved to campus housing effective immediately. Standard dormitory, shared room, the same arrangement every other student at that university has." Serah felt like the floor had dropped out from under her, like she was falling through empty space with nothing to grab onto. "You can't be serious," she whispered, but even as she said it, she could see in his face that he was deadly serious. "Dad, this is my home, you can't just—" "I can, and I have," he interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut. "Your credit cards have been canceled, every single one of them. Your Mercedes was sold this afternoon to a very happy buyer who actually earned the money to purchase it. Your monthly allowance has been permanently discontinued. And this apartment." He gestured around the space she'd taken for granted for years, the floor-to-ceiling windows with their million-dollar view, the imported Italian furniture, the designer everything. "This was never yours, Serah. It was mine, and I'm taking it back." The words hit her like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last, stealing the breath from her lungs. "You're cutting me off completely?" she asked, her voice breaking despite her desperate attempt to maintain composure. "Over grades? Over school? Over who you've become," Alexander corrected, and there was something almost sad underneath the steel in his voice, though it didn't soften the blow. "I've bought you everything except a work ethic, and that ends today. You will move into that dormitory, you will attend your classes, and you will earn passing grades through actual effort, not through my donations or my name. And Serah—" He paused, making sure she was looking directly at him, making sure she understood every word. "You will graduate with honors, or you will be permanently cut off from the family fortune and your inheritance. No second chances, no negotiations, no safety net. You either become someone worth respecting, or you learn what it means to have nothing." Serah wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, wanted to tell him he couldn't do this to her, but the movers were still packing around them with professional indifference, and her father's expression made it clear the conversation was already over. This wasn't a threat or a warning, it was done. He'd already executed the plan before she'd even walked through the door. Within 2 hours, everything she owned was packed into boxes and loaded onto a truck headed for campus. Within 3 hours, she was standing in a cramped dormitory room barely larger than her former walk-in closet, staring at bunk beds and mismatched furniture and walls that had been painted the color of institutional despair. Her roommate, a girl named Jessica who looked genuinely excited to meet her, quickly realized Serah wasn't in the mood for conversation and retreated to her side of the room with awkward silence. The next morning, Serah woke up to an alarm she'd never needed before, because there was no one to drive her to campus anymore, and the bus schedule didn't care about her beauty routine. She stood at the bus stop in yesterday's clothes because she hadn't unpacked yet, surrounded by other students who didn't give her a second glance, who didn't know or care who her father was. When the bus finally arrived, packed with bodies and smelling like coffee and old upholstery, she had to stand holding a grimy pole for balance while the driver took corners too fast and other passengers pressed against her without apology. At lunch, she stood in the cafeteria line like everyone else, holding a plastic tray, staring at food that looked nothing like the private chef meals she'd grown up eating. She sat alone at a corner table, picking at something that was supposed to be lasagna, watching groups of students laugh and talk around her while her phone stayed silent. Her friends, or the people she'd thought were her friends, had stopped responding to her texts the moment word got out that she'd been cut off. Apparently, being Serah Alexander only mattered when Serah Alexander could afford bottle service at exclusive clubs and shopping trips that ended in four-figure purchases. By the end of the week, the isolation was suffocating. She tried to study, really tried, spreading her textbooks across her cramped desk and staring at pages full of words and symbols that might as well have been written in a foreign language. She'd never actually learned how to learn, had never needed to break down complex concepts or build understanding from the ground up. Every tutor she'd ever had simply gave her the answers to memorize, and every professor had been too intimidated by her father's donations to push her toward actual comprehension. Now, with a calculus midterm looming just days away and no one to cheat off of or pay to do the work for her, Serah was drowning. The equations blurred together on the page, mocking her with their complexity, reminding her that she was 20 years old and didn't know how to do something as basic as study independently. She was going to fail, spectacularly and publicly, and this time there would be no safety net to catch her. It was past midnight on a Thursday when desperation finally drove her out of her room and into the dormitory's common area, where at least the fluorescent lighting felt less suffocating than her cramped desk. She'd grabbed her calculus textbook and a notebook already filled with crossed-out attempts at problem-solving, and she'd collapsed into one of the worn couches with tears already burning at the corners of her eyes. Around her, the building was mostly silent except for the distant hum of a vending machine and the occasional creak of pipes in the walls. She didn't notice Marcus Johnson at first, didn't see him pushing his cleaning cart slowly down the hallway with the same quiet efficiency he brought to every shift. He'd been working the night shift in this building for 3 years, invisible to most students, just another part of the background they moved through without really seeing. But Marcus saw everything, including the girl on the couch with her face in her hands, her expensive textbook open to a page she clearly didn't understand, her whole body radiating the kind of desperation that came from finally hitting a wall money couldn't break through. He paused near her, pretending to wipe down a table while his eyes scanned the problem she'd been attempting to solve. The equation was written out incorrectly, her approach backwards from the very first step, which meant every calculation after that was doomed to fail no matter how hard she worked. "You're approaching it backwards," he said quietly, his voice calm and unhurried, like he was commenting on the weather rather than interrupting a stranger's private breakdown. "Subscribe if you believe wisdom doesn't wear designer clothes. The proud will skip this part, but the wise won't." Serah's head snapped up, her eyes red and swollen, her face flushed with embarrassment at being caught crying over homework like a child. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharper than she intended, defensive walls slamming back into place out of habit. "I don't remember asking for your opinion." Marcus didn't flinch, didn't react to the dismissiveness in her voice. He just continued wiping the table with slow, methodical movements, his expression neutral. "The derivative of that function," he continued, nodding toward her notebook without moving closer, respecting her space while still offering help she hadn't asked for. "You're trying to apply the chain rule, but you need the product rule first. That's why it's not working. You're starting from the wrong place." Serah opened her mouth to snap at him again, to tell him to mind his own business and go back to mopping floors or whatever it was janitors were supposed to do, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the desperation, or the fact that she'd spent hours trying to solve that single problem without success. She looked down at her notebook, at the mess of numbers and symbols she'd written and crossed out and rewritten, and then back at the man in the janitor's uniform who was still calmly cleaning as if he hadn't just explained something in 10 seconds that she'd been struggling with all night. The product rule, she repeated slowly, her anger deflating into confusion. The textbook said. The textbook assumes you understand when to use which rule, Marcus said, still not looking directly at her, giving her the dignity of not making this moment feel like charity. Most students do by the time they get to this level. But if you never learned the foundation properly, then all the advanced techniques just become noise. He moved to the next table, his cleaning methodical and unhurried. You need to break the function into its parts first. See what you're actually working with. Then you can decide which tool to use. It's like trying to fix a car engine without knowing what each part does. You'll just keep turning the wrong screws and wondering why nothing works. Serah stared at him, her mind racing to process what he was saying, and suddenly, impossibly, the problem that had been incomprehensible just minutes ago started to make sense. She could see where she'd gone wrong, could see the logic she'd been missing, could see the path forward with a clarity that felt almost shocking. "Wait," she said, grabbing her pencil and scribbling frantically in her notebook, reworking the problem from the beginning with the product rule like he'd suggested. The numbers aligned, the equation balanced, and when she reached the end and saw that her answer matched the one in the back of the textbook, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Genuine pride in accomplishing something on her own. She looked up, ready to thank him or ask him to explain another problem or maybe just to understand how a janitor knew calculus better than her expensive tutors ever had. But Marcus was already walking away, his cleaning cart squeaking slightly as he pushed it down the hallway toward the next floor. He didn't look back, didn't wait for gratitude or acknowledgement, just continued his work as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. Serah sat there in the fluorescent-lit common area, her textbook open in front of her, her notebook filled with a correctly solved problem, and her mind reeling from the impossible fact that a janitor, a man she'd never bothered to see before tonight, had just taught her more in 2 minutes than any professor or tutor had managed in years. And for the first time since her father had stripped away everything she'd taken for granted, Serah Alexander felt something other than despair. She felt the smallest, most fragile spark of possibility. The next night, Serah found herself standing in the dormitory hallway at 1:45 a.m., feeling ridiculous and desperate in equal measure. She'd spent the entire day thinking about that brief encounter with Marcus, about how easily he'd explained something that had seemed impossible just moments before, and about the fact that she'd managed to solve 3 more problems on her own after he'd left. Now she was waiting for him to appear on his shift, clutching her calculus textbook against her chest like a shield, rehearsing what she'd say and hating how awkward this felt. When Marcus finally rounded the corner with his cleaning cart, she straightened up immediately, her heart pounding harder than it should have been. "Hi," she said, and then immediately wanted to cringe at how small her voice sounded. "I'm Serah. I don't know if you remember me from last night, but you helped me with that calculus problem, and I was wondering." She paused, swallowing her pride because apparently that was something she had to do now. "Could you help me again? I have a midterm in 2 days, and I don't know what I'm doing, and you explained it better in 2 minutes than anyone ever has." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Serah braced herself for rejection or worse, for him to throw her own dismissiveness from the night before back in her face. Instead, he simply nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I take my break at 2, he said, his voice quiet and measured. "There's an empty lecture hall on the 3rd floor, room 312. Meet me there if you're serious about learning, not just about passing." Serah blinked, caught off guard by the condition embedded in his response. "What's the difference?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Everything," Marcus replied, and then he continued down the hallway with his cart, leaving her standing there with more questions than she'd started with. At exactly 2 o'clock, Serah pushed open the door to Lecture Hall 312 and found Marcus already there, sitting in the front row with a notebook and pen laid out on the desk beside him. The room was dark except for the emergency exit lights and the glow from the hallway spilling through the doorway, casting long shadows across the rows of empty seats that stretched upward toward the back wall. It felt strange being in a classroom in the middle of the night, like they were doing something illicit even though all they were doing was studying. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to the desk next to him, and Serah obeyed without the sarcastic comment she would have made just a week ago. "Show me where you're stuck." What followed was unlike any tutoring session Serah had ever experienced. Marcus didn't just give her answers or walk her through problems step by step while she passively copied his work. Instead, he asked questions. Constant, relentless questions that forced her to think, to explain her reasoning, to understand why she was doing what she was doing instead of just memorizing procedures. "Why did you choose that method?" he'd ask when she started solving a problem, and when she'd stumble over an explanation, he'd push harder. "No, don't tell me what the textbook says. Tell me why it makes sense. What's actually happening in this equation?" "No, I couldn't," Marcus interrupted gently, and there was no bitterness in his voice, just a simple statement. It was exhausting and frustrating and completely different from anything she'd experienced before, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. The concepts that had seemed like incomprehensible gibberish started to click into place, not as random rules to memorize but as logical patterns she could actually understand. By the time Marcus's break ended at 2:30, Serah had filled 5 pages with notes in her own handwriting, notes that actually made sense to her because she'd worked through the logic herself instead of just copying someone else's thinking. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked as he stood to leave, and there must have been something different in her voice, genuine interest instead of entitled expectation, because Marcus paused and looked at her with something that might have been approval. "If you do the practice problems I assigned first," he said, and Serah realized with a start that he had assigned her homework, and she was actually planning to do it. They fell into a routine after that, meeting 3 nights a week at 2 a.m. in the empty lecture hall while the rest of campus slept. Serah started showing up early, not because she had to but because she wanted to, arriving at 1:45 with her questions already written out and her previous assignments completed. She took notes differently now, not just copying what Marcus said but writing down her own thoughts and questions, marking the places where she didn't understand something so she could ask for clarification instead of pretending she knew more than she did. And slowly, something fundamental began to shift in how Serah approached not just calculus but everything. She started participating in her other classes, raising her hand to ask questions instead of sitting silently in the back row scrolling through her phone. She stopped wearing the designer outfits that had once been her armor, opting instead for comfortable jeans and simple sweaters because she was more focused on what she was learning than what she looked like. She even found herself getting genuinely excited about ideas and concepts she'd never bothered to think about before, staying after class to continue discussions with professors who looked genuinely shocked that Serah Alexander was engaging with the material. But the more time she spent with Marcus, the more something didn't add up. His teaching style was too sophisticated, his knowledge too deep and comprehensive for someone who supposedly just cleaned buildings for a living. The way he explained complex mathematical concepts and connected them to philosophical ideas, the way he referenced academic papers and research she'd never heard of, the way he could switch effortlessly between calculus and literature and economics depending on what she was struggling with, none of it made sense for a janitor, no matter how naturally intelligent he might be. So one night after their session ended, Serah did what any curious student would do in the digital age. She Googled him. She typed Marcus Johnson MIT professor into the search bar, half expecting nothing to come up, half hoping she was wrong about her suspicions. She wasn't wrong. The first result was an old faculty page, archived but still accessible, showing a younger Marcus in academic regalia standing in front of MIT's iconic dome. Dr. Marcus Johnson, professor of applied mathematics and philosophy, dual PhDs from Stanford, published author, award-winning educator. The accolades went on, a career that read like something out of an academic fantasy, someone who'd reached the absolute pinnacle of his field. Then came the articles about his fall from grace. News stories from 6 years ago, detailing a scandal that had rocked MIT's administration. A major pharmaceutical donor demanding that research data be altered to fast-track a drug to market, and Dr. Marcus Johnson refusing to comply. He'd gone public with the truth, held a press conference, submitted evidence to federal regulators, and in doing so had made himself a pariah in the academic world he'd dedicated his life to. The donor withdrew millions in funding, the university asked for his resignation, and despite being proven right when the drug was eventually pulled from clinical trials for safety concerns, Marcus found himself blacklisted from every major institution in the country. The personal cost had been even higher. Articles mentioned his divorce, his estrangement from his daughter who sided with her mother, the foreclosure on his home when legal fees depleted his savings. There was even a photo from a year after the scandal. Marcus looking 20 years older, hollow-eyed and defeated, standing outside a courtroom after losing custody rights. Serah sat in her cramped dorm room staring at her laptop screen, her hands trembling slightly as she processed what she was reading. This man, this brilliant, accomplished scholar who'd sacrificed everything for his principles, was working the night shift as a janitor, mopping floors and emptying trash cans in the same type of institution that had destroyed his career. And he'd been spending his break time teaching her, a spoiled rich girl who'd never appreciated education a day in her life, not because she'd paid him or because her father's name meant anything to him, but simply because she'd asked for help. The next night, Serah arrived at lecture hall 312 15 minutes early, her emotions churning between gratitude and guilt and something she couldn't quite name. When Marcus walked in at exactly 2 o'clock, she didn't wait for him to sit down. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended because she was angry. Not at him, but at the unfairness of everything, at the system that had punished him for doing the right thing, at herself for not seeing past his uniform. Dr. Johnson. MIT, Stanford, published researcher, all of it. Why are you working as a janitor? Why are you here? Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or resignation, like he'd known this moment would come eventually. He set his cleaning supplies down slowly and took his usual seat, silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "You did your research," he said quietly, "and it wasn't a question. Good. That's the first step in real learning. Questioning what you think you know." "That's not an answer," Serah pressed, sitting down across from him but refusing to let this go. "You could be teaching at any university, you could be—" "A fact. I made a choice 6 years ago to tell the truth when powerful people wanted me to lie, and that choice cost me everything in the only world I'd ever known. Academia doesn't forgive whistleblowers, Serah, no matter how right they were. So yes, I clean buildings now. I mop floors and empty trash cans and watch students walk past me like I'm invisible, and I do it because it's honest work that keeps me connected to the only thing I still love, learning. Education. Teaching people who actually want to understand." Serah felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, though she couldn't entirely explain why. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she meant it for everything. For what had happened to him, for how she dismissed him that first night, for representing the same kind of privilege and indifference that had allowed institutions to destroy good people like him. "Don't be sorry," Marcus said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Be better. That's why I'm helping you, Serah. Not because you need to pass some exam, but because you have the capacity to be someone who actually contributes something meaningful to the world instead of just consuming resources other people fought to create." Now, he pulled out his notebook with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything. "Let's get to work." And they did. 2 weeks later, Serah walked out of her calculus midterm feeling something she'd never experienced after an academic evaluation. Confidence. Not the false bravado of someone who assumed their father's money would fix everything, but genuine confidence that came from actually understanding the material, from being able to work through problems using logic and knowledge she'd built herself. When the grades were posted 3 days later and she saw the A next to her name, she had to read it twice to make sure she wasn't misinterpreting the letter. An A. Not a pity pass, not a grade influenced by donations or family connections, but a real, earned that she'd achieved through actual work. The pride that surged through her was overwhelming, bringing tears to her eyes right there in the hallway while other students pushed past her to check their own scores. She'd never earned anything real before in her entire life, and this one letter on a grade sheet felt more valuable than anything her father had ever bought her. That night, instead of just showing up to her session with Marcus alone, Serah brought 2 other students with her, a girl named Rebecca from her economics class who was on academic probation, and a guy named James who'd failed calculus twice already and was facing expulsion if he didn't pass the semester. Both of them looked skeptical when Serah explained that a janitor had been tutoring her, looked even more skeptical when they walked into lecture hall 312 and saw Marcus in his work uniform. But within 20 minutes of him working with them, their skepticism transformed into the same shocked understanding Serah had felt. Word spread carefully after that, passed quietly between students who were struggling and desperate and tired of expensive tutoring programs that catered to people who were already succeeding. Within a month, their little group had grown to 8 people, then 12, then 15. They found an unused basement classroom that had been abandoned for renovations that never happened, and they transformed it into their sanctuary. Bringing in cushions and better lighting, creating a space where learning actually mattered more than performance, where questions were encouraged instead of mocked, where everyone's voice carried equal weight. They met 3 nights a week, and Marcus taught them all not just how to pass their classes but how to think critically, how to question assumptions, how to connect ideas across disciplines and understand the world as something complex and interconnected rather than a series of isolated facts to memorize for tests. And Serah, who'd started this journey as the girl who had everything and valued nothing, found herself becoming someone entirely different. Someone who arrived early with fresh coffee for everyone, someone who helped explain concepts to newer students, someone who was building friendships based on mutual respect and shared struggle rather than shared bank account balances. She still lived in the cramped dorm room, still took the bus to campus, still ate cafeteria food and wore clothes that didn't cost more than most people's monthly rent. But somewhere along the way, she'd stopped resenting these changes and started recognizing them for what they really were. Freedom from the shallow existence she'd been trapped in, freedom to discover who she actually was beneath the privilege that had defined and limited her for 20 years. And as she sat in that basement classroom surrounded by people who'd become genuine friends, listening to Marcus explain how mathematical patterns appeared in nature and philosophy and human behavior, Serah realized something profound. She wasn't just learning academics anymore. She was learning how to be a person with purpose beyond her last name, someone who contributed instead of just consumed, someone who finally, genuinely mattered. Serah had been dreading this dinner for 3 days, but she'd also been preparing for it with the same determination she now brought to her academics. Her mid-semester grades had just been posted. 3 A's, 2 B+s, and a GPA that had climbed from a catastrophic 1.2 to a respectable 3.4 in just 8 weeks. These weren't numbers her father had bought or professors had been intimidated into giving her. They were real, earned through late nights in that basement classroom and early mornings reviewing notes she'd actually taken herself. And she wanted her father to know the truth about how she'd achieved them, even if that truth was going to be uncomfortable for both of them. She'd invited Alexander to a small restaurant near campus, nothing fancy but nicer than the cafeteria, a neutral space where neither of them held home field advantage. When he arrived exactly on time, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and expensive watch, Serah felt the old instinct to shrink under his judgment, but she pushed it down and met his eyes with steady confidence. You said you wanted to discuss your progress, Alexander said as they sat down, his tone polite but distant, like she was a business associate rather than his daughter. I saw your grades. They're acceptable. They're more than acceptable, Dad, Serah replied, keeping her voice calm but firm. They're the best grades I've ever earned, and I earned them myself. No tutors you paid for, no donations smoothing things over, just actual learning. Something flickered in Alexander's expression. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest hint of pride, but it disappeared quickly behind his usual controlled mask. I'm glad the consequences motivated you, he said, reaching for his water glass. Perhaps now you understand the value of hard work. I do understand it, Serah agreed, but not because you took away my credit cards. I understand it because someone actually taught me how to learn instead of just threatening me for not knowing how. She paused, knowing this next part would shatter whatever fragile civility existed between them. His name is Marcus Johnson, and he's a janitor at my dormitory. He's been tutoring me 3 nights a week for the past 2 months, and he's the reason I'm not failing out anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander set his glass down with deliberate precision, his jaw tightening in that way that meant he was choosing his words carefully to avoid saying something he'd regret. A janitor, he repeated slowly, and the contempt in his voice was razor sharp. You're telling me that a man who mops floors taught you calculus? That's embarrassing, Serah. That's not something you should be proud of, it's something you should be ashamed to admit. The old Serah, the one who'd existed just 2 months ago, would have shrunk from that judgment, would have backtracked and apologized and tried to minimize what she'd said. But the new Serah, the one who'd learned that real worth wasn't measured in bank accounts or job titles, felt anger rise hot and sharp in her chest. What's embarrassing, she said, her voice low but steady, is that I had to find someone who actually cared about teaching instead of networking with you to learn anything real. Marcus has taught me more in 8 weeks than 4 years of expensive private school and every tutor you ever hired managed to teach me combined. And you want to know why? Because he sees students as people, not as revenue streams or networking opportunities. Alexander's face went rigid with fury, his eyes narrowing in a way Serah had seen directed at underperforming executives but never quite so intensely at her. This ends tonight, he said coldly. I'll speak to the university administration tomorrow and have this situation handled appropriately. A janitor has no business tutoring students, and I will not have my daughter. Go ahead, Dad, Serah interrupted, and there was steel in her voice she'd never known she possessed. Make your calls, throw your weight around. Get him fired if that makes you feel powerful. But you'll be taking away the only person who ever saw me as something more than your disappointing investment. The only person who believed I could be better instead of just demanding that I magically become someone I'd never been taught how to be. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that drew stares from nearby tables. He didn't raise his voice, he never needed to, but the anger radiating from him was palpable. We'll discuss this when you're thinking rationally, he said, and then he walked out of the restaurant without looking back, leaving Serah sitting alone with her untouched meal and the certain knowledge that she'd just declared war on the most powerful person in her life. She was right to be worried. 3 days later, Marcus received a summons to the dean's office that came with the kind of official letterhead that meant serious consequences were in motion. When he arrived at the appointed time, he found not just Dean Morrison but also the university's legal counsel, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit who looked like she billed by the minute, sitting on the other side of an imposing mahogany desk. Mr. Johnson, the dean began, his tone carefully neutral in the way that always preceded bad news. We've received several complaints from concerned parents regarding your interactions with students. Specifically, allegations of inappropriate relationships developing between janitorial staff and students under your influence. Marcus sat in the chair they'd indicated, his posture upright and his expression calm despite the accusation hanging in the air between them. "Inappropriate relationships," he repeated, his voice measured. "I assume you mean the tutoring sessions I've been conducting during my break time, helping students who were failing their courses learn the material they're paying tens of thousands of dollars to supposedly be taught." The legal counsel leaned forward slightly, her pen poised above a legal pad. "Your job description is janitorial maintenance, Mr. Johnson. Teaching students is not part of your responsibilities, and engaging in such activities without proper authorization creates liability concerns for the university. We must ask that you cease all academic interaction with students immediately." "When you say, cease all academic interaction," Marcus said quietly, "you mean stop helping failing students understand material that your institution has failed to help them comprehend. Students who were on the verge of expulsion, who your expensive tutoring programs had written off as lost causes, who came to me desperate and are now passing their classes. That's what you want me to stop doing." Dean Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, because when Marcus put it that way, the request sounded exactly as indefensible as it was. "The concern," he said carefully, "is that you're operating outside the proper channels. If you want to tutor students, there are official processes. Processes that would require credentials I no longer have access to because I refused to falsify research data 6 years ago," Marcus interrupted, and there was no bitterness in his voice, just a statement of fact. "I've been cleaning up your institution's failures for 3 years now. I'm just doing it differently than you expected." The silence that followed was heavy with implications no one wanted to speak aloud. Finally, the legal counsel cleared her throat. "Regardless of your intentions, Mr. Johnson, if you continue teaching students without authorization, we will have no choice but to terminate your employment. Is that clear?" Marcus stood slowly, his dignity intact despite the threat being leveled against him. "Perfectly clear," he said, and walked out of the office knowing that the students who'd come to depend on him were about to lose the only real education some of them had ever received. But Marcus had underestimated Serah Alexander. Underestimated Serah Alexander. That same evening, the university newspaper published an op-ed that would change everything. The title read, "The Invisible Educators," and it was written by Serah, her name displayed prominently beneath the headline alongside her student ID number so no one could dismiss it as anonymous rabble-rousing. In clear, passionate prose that demonstrated exactly how much her writing had improved over the past 2 months, Serah told Marcus's entire story. His credentials, his fall from academic grace for refusing to compromise his ethics, and his current position cleaning the same type of institution that had destroyed his career. She detailed how he'd been spending his break time teaching failing students, how his underground classroom had saved over 20 students from academic expulsion, and how the university administration had now threatened to fire him for doing what their own expensive programs had failed to accomplish. The article went viral within hours. Students shared it across social media, professors forwarded it to colleagues, and by morning it had been picked up by local news outlets hungry for a David versus Goliath story about educational inequality. Campus exploded with debate, some defending the administration's need to maintain proper channels, but far more questioning why a janitor could accomplish in weeks what tenured professors and expensive tutoring programs couldn't manage in years. Serah didn't stop with the article. 2 days later, during her economics lecture, the professor was discussing market efficiency theory when Serah raised her hand and politely dismantled the entire argument using sources Marcus had introduced her to. Research on behavioral economics, studies on systemic inequality, data showing how supposedly efficient markets consistently failed the most vulnerable populations. The professor, clearly caught off guard by this sudden display of critical thinking from a student who'd previously been known only for her disengagement, asked where she'd learned to analyze economic theory with such sophistication. "From someone this university pays minimum wage," Serah replied clearly, making sure every student in the lecture hall could hear her. "Someone with more knowledge in his little finger than most of us will accumulate in our entire lives, who's being threatened with termination for the crime of helping students actually learn. The murmur that rippled through the classroom was electric. By Friday, Serah had organized what started as a small protest and grew into something much larger. Over 200 students gathered outside the administration building, holding signs that read "Recognize Real Educators" and "Knowledge has no job title" and "Dr. Marcus Johnson, Janitor and Teacher." They weren't violent or destructive, just present and persistent, refusing to move until the administration agreed to meet with student representatives. The standoff lasted 6 hours. News crews arrived, filming the protest and interviewing students about why they were willing to risk disciplinary action to defend a janitor. Social media coverage spread beyond campus, turning a local issue into a national conversation about educational accessibility and whose knowledge society values. And through it all, Serah stood at the front of the crowd, the girl who'd once represented everything wrong with privilege now using that same privilege as a shield for someone who'd never had any. By evening, the administration capitulated. Dean Morrison emerged with an announcement. The university would create an official peer tutoring position, properly compensated and recognized, and they were offering it to Marcus Johnson along with an apology for how the situation had been handled. It wasn't everything. Marcus would never get his tenured position back, would never fully reclaim what had been taken from him. But it was acknowledgement, validation, and a chance to do openly what he'd been doing in secret. When semester grades were posted 2 weeks later, Serah's GPA had climbed to 3.8, the highest she'd ever achieved in her entire academic career. But the number felt almost irrelevant compared to everything else she'd gained. Standing in the basement classroom that had become their permanent space, officially sanctioned now and properly equipped, surrounded by students who'd become genuine friends and taught by a man who'd shown her what real education looked like, Serah finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her through all his threats and ultimatums. Success wasn't about what you inherited or what appeared in your bank account. It was about what you built through effort, what you contributed that made other people's lives better, who you became when no one was watching and you had to rely on substance instead of surface appearance. She'd arrived at college as Serah Alexander, millionaire's daughter, defined entirely by her father's name and wealth. She was leaving the semester as just Serah, a student who'd failed and fought her way back, a friend who'd stood up when standing up was costly, a person who'd learned that being truly seen meant letting people look past the armor of privilege to the human being underneath. And as Marcus began the evening session, asking the group questions that would challenge and expand their thinking, Serah opened her notebook to a fresh page and began taking notes in handwriting that was confident and clear, ready to learn not because she had to but because she finally, genuinely wanted to. From entitled to earned, from invisible to truly seen, from privileged ignorance to purposeful knowledge. That was the journey she'd traveled, and she was just getting started.
Thank you for watching the story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So, do check it out.